June 11, 1944. 20,000 feet above Chartres, France. Major Robert Turner of the 354th Fighter Group eased his gloved hand over the throttle of his P-51 Mustang. The indicator needle climbed past 61 inches of mercury, far beyond the limit stamped on every checklist. The Packard-built Merlin engine answered with a metallic roar, a sound thick with pressure and heat. The airframe trembled, but the vibrations felt alive, purposeful. Below him, the fields of northern France blurred into a haze of dust and burning convoys. For months, American fighters had flown at the edge of their performance envelope, bound by the chemistry of fuel. The standard 100-octane blend defined what was possible. Every climb, every dive, every escort mission from England to the Rhine had been a calculation against detonation and failure. But today, the calculation had changed. Inside Turner's wing tanks sloshed a liquid no one outside a handful of engineers fully understood. The first flight, using 150-grade aviation fuel, had begun quietly that morning. Ground crews at Lashendon and Boxted had handled the drums with unusual care. They were painted purple, the warning color for something volatile, almost experimental. It looked like ordinary gasoline, but its vapor carried the sharp, sweet scent of toluene and lead. To the men who fueled the aircraft, it felt like loading dynamite into a gas tank. At full power, the Mustang surged forward as if weight had been subtracted from the sky itself. The Merlin supercharger howled at 67 inches of boost, delivering over 2,000 horsepower. The airspeed indicator swept past 490 miles per hour, 756 km/h, and continued climbing. Turner held the throttle steady. The horizon shimmered. His altimeter read 28,000 feet, 8,530 meters. He had never seen a piston engine behave like this. To the north, 4 Messerschmitt Bf-109Gs clawed for altitude, their engines screaming in thin air. They had intercepted Mustangs before and knew the rhythm of these duels. Americans diving, Germans climbing, the inevitable reversal as the Merlin's power faded with altitude. But now the pattern broke. Turner's flight didn't descend, it climbed. The Germans stalled first, their propellers biting at nothing. The Mustangs curved above them, faster, lighter, untouched by the physics that once ruled the air. Each second of combat became an equation the Luftwaffe could no longer solve. Their aircraft still carried the same guns, the same training, the same resolve. What had changed was invisible, flowing through fuel lines and into cylinders. Chemistry turned into strategy. By dusk, Allied ground crews were already writing down the results. Fuel consumption increased by 17%. Power output rose by nearly 1/5. Maximum level speed approached 490 miles per hour, 789 km/h. On paper, it was a small numerical gain. In the sky, it was domination, measured in seconds and altitude. That night, as the Mustangs returned to their bases, engines ticking with heat, the mechanics could smell the difference long before the aircraft stopped rolling. The scent was sharper, denser, like ozone after lightning. No new design, no secret weapon, only fuel. A purple liquid that had turned ordinary machines into something faster than fear itself. The story began long before that June flight over France. Not in a cockpit, but in laboratories and refineries. In 1938, a group of British chemists at the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company began testing new methods to raise the octane rating of aviation fuel. Their challenge was simple in theory and impossible in practice. Prevent gasoline from detonating under extreme pressure. Detonation, or knock, destroyed engines. Every degree of compression, every pound of boost, every new supercharger demanded a higher resistance to that violent pre-ignition. Before the war, most military aircraft used fuels rated between 87 and 92 octane. Even these required careful blending and the addition of tetraethyl lead, a toxic compound first developed in the United States in the 1920s. But by 1939, Rolls-Royce engineers working on the Merlin engine realized that the war to come would not be won by design alone. It would be won by chemistry. If fuel could be made to tolerate more boost pressure, the same engine could produce more power without adding a single pound of weight. The leap from 87 to 100 octane transformed British and later American aviation. The Spitfire Mk5, fueled by the new 100 octane blend, gained an additional 260 horsepower overnight. The Battle of Britain was fought not only with aluminum and courage, but with hydrocarbon molecules tuned to detonate later, smoother, and hotter. When the United States entered the war, its oil companies, Standard Oil of New Jersey, Texaco, Shell, and Esso, brought industrial capacity to a field the British had pioneered. They turned laboratory batches into rivers of fuel, refining tens of millions of gallons each month, and shipping them through the Atlantic in convoys guarded by destroyers. Yet even as 100 octane became the Allied standard, engineers at Shell's Thornton Research Center in Cheshire and at the U.S. Naval Air Experimental Station in Philadelphia were already looking higher. By late 1941, their tests produced small quantities of experimental blends labeled 115, 145, 130, 150, even a 150, 170, numbers representing the fuel's performance at lean and rich mixtures. The secret lay in additives: triptoluene for density, iso-octane for smooth combustion, and increasing doses of tetraethyl lead. The mixture was volatile, expensive, and toxic, but in testing it pushed engines far beyond theoretical limits. In January 1942, Rolls-Royce technicians at Hucknall fitted a Merlin 61 to a dynamometer and fed it 150-grade fuel for the first time. The results startled even veteran engineers. At 25 pounds of boost pressure, the engine produced 2,000 horsepower, nearly 400 more than its rated maximum. The connecting rods glowed dull red. The supercharger screamed like a siren. But the detonation that should have torn the cylinders apart never came. The fuel burned smoothly, evenly, and completely. Chemistry had extended the boundaries of metallurgy. Production, however, was another matter. Britain lacked both the raw materials and the refining capacity to produce such fuel in quantity. The process of alkylation, combining light hydrocarbons with isobutylene in the presence of sulfuric acid, required massive catalytic plants, specialized alloys, and steady supplies of high-grade crude. The United States alone possessed the industrial base to make it possible. In 1943, the War Production Board authorized the construction of a new generation of refineries dedicated to high-octane aviation fuel. By the following year, American output exceeded 40 million gallons per day. Each gallon represented a chain of precision, stretching from Gulf Coast oil fields to European airfields. Crude oil was cracked into smaller molecules at 510 degrees, reformed under pressure, blended with lead and aromatic compounds, and tested in octane rating engines that simulated combustion at 7,000 revolutions per minute. Batches that failed the detonation test were recycled. Those that passed were tinted deep purple for identification. Officially, it was called 100, 150 grade. Among airmen, it became simply purple fuel. The decision to introduce it into combat units came from a man more often associated with paperwork than with flight: Brigadier General Benjamin Kelsey, chief of the Flight Test Division. In early 1944, he authorized limited operational trials with the 8th Air Force in England. The first squadrons equipped were the 354th, 357th, and 339th Fighter Groups, flying P-51 Bs and Ds over France and Germany. The trials were secret. Only senior mechanics and flight leaders knew the truth about the new fuel. To everyone else, it was merely a special blend for cold weather performance. Meanwhile, German chemists faced a crisis of their own. Synthetic fuel from coal hydrogenation plants supplied over 90% of the Reich's aviation gasoline. These facilities, Leuna, Bolin, and Politz, produced fuel averaging only 87 to 96 octane. To reach 100, they relied on scarce additives like iso-octane and aromatic boosters, both dependent on imports that Allied bombing had cut off. Luftwaffe engines designed for higher octane ratings were forced to run at reduced boost pressures. The disparity widened with every month of war. By mid-1944, an American refinery could produce in 1 week more 150-grade fuel than Germany could refine of any grade in a month. Allied bombers destroyed the Leuna works in May, and with it, the last hope of parity. When captured, German engineers later examined samples of 150-grade fuel. They described it with disbelief. The density, volatility, and anti-knock index were beyond what their laboratories had ever achieved. "It is not gasoline," one chemist wrote in his report. "It is a chemical weapon." The shift from 100 to 150 grade seemed, on paper, a minor adjustment, 20 or 30 points in a technical table. But the mathematics of combustion turned those numbers into transformation. Each unit of octane delayed detonation by a measurable fraction of a millisecond. Each fraction allowed higher compression, greater supercharger boost, and more energy released before the flame front reached the cylinder wall. Multiply that by 12 cylinders, 2,000 revolutions per minute, and 6 hours of flight, and the advantage became decisive. By the spring of 1944, the refinement of fuel had become as strategic as the refinement of uranium. Every barrel carried the potential for altitude, speed, and range. When American tankers crossed the Atlantic, their holds contained not just energy, but supremacy distilled into liquid form. In conference rooms at Wright Field and Stanlow, the men who understood the chemistry watched combat reports arrive from France and Germany. Pilots spoke of Mustangs that climbed like meteors and dived faster than air could part around them. The numbers confirmed it. At identical power settings, aircraft using 150-grade fuel reached higher altitudes, accelerated 20% faster, and extended range by nearly 80 kilometers per mission. The margin was invisible but absolute. By the time German intelligence began noticing the shift, the damage was irreversible. The Luftwaffe's remaining interceptors fought with engines derated to prevent knock. Their pilots complained of sluggish climbs and poor acceleration. In the combat diaries of Jägerschwader 11 and 26, scattered entries began to appear. Enemy fighters exhibit unprecedented speed at altitude. Mustangs impossible to evade in dive. The pattern was clear, but the cause was hidden inside the fuel tanks they would never touch. The chemistry perfected in refineries and laboratories had crossed the threshold into war. Octane numbers, not propellers or wings, were deciding who reached the target first and who never returned. By June 1944, 150-grade fuel was flowing through flexible hoses onto French soil. The barrels bore no markings except the faint violet stain that clung to the steel. Every drop carried the work of thousands, chemists, refiners, tank crews, and sailors, all unseen, all contributing to the same invisible weapon. The war in the air was no longer a contest of machines. It was a contest of molecules, measured in octane, distilled in secrecy, and ignited above Europe. June 13, 1944. 2 days after the first operational use of 150-grade fuel, the 357th Fighter Group took off from Leisten, bound for Leipzig. The mission called for a long-range escort of B-17s striking synthetic oil facilities east of the Rhine. Weather over the North Sea was broken. Cloud tops around 6,000 arm. Visibility clear beyond the front. At 0810, the first formations crossed the French coast. At 09 radio chatter filled the network. Bandits, 10 o'clock high. The Luftwaffe came in strength. Jagdgeschwader 11 and 300 launched over 120 Bf-109s and FW-190s from Stendal and Zerbst. Most were G6 variants running on 96-octane synthetic fuel, rated for 1.4280 of boost. Their engines, Daimler-Benz 605s, could produce barely 1,450 horsepower before detonation threatened to shatter pistons. The American Mustangs, burning 150 grades, pushed their Merlins to 67 inches of mercury, 2,000 horsepower sustained. It was not an even contest. Captain Don Gentile led Blue Flight through 810 cloud at 7,600 miles. The contrails of the bombers cut white seams across the sky. German fighters broke through in pairs, attacking from above the formation. Gentile rolled inverted and dove. At 470 ppm, 756 km/h, the Mustang no longer shuddered. The fuel burned cooler than its predecessors. Detonation was absent. At full throttle, the Merlin's note dropped into a deep mechanical pulse, a rhythm that never faltered. At 0918, radio logs recorded his call. Splash 190, diving east. Another pilot, Lieutenant John England, chased a 109 down to $3,000 mere before pulling out at 520 mil, go 837 km/h. Later, his ground crew confirmed the manifold pressure had held steady through the entire dive. Under previous limits, that run would have destroyed the engine. Instead, it had barely reached the fuel's thermal ceiling. Over Leipzig, the bombers held formation with unprecedented discipline. Losses that spring had averaged 1 in 20. That day, none fell to enemy fighters. The Luftwaffe's attacks lost cohesion as the Mustangs swept in from multiple altitudes. For the first time, German pilots reported being outclimbed by American escorts above $8,000 MEM. Their reports mentioned unreal acceleration and pursuit beyond our ceiling. In the debriefing tent that evening, maintenance officers examined the engines. No piston scoring, no burnt valves. The new fuel had not merely increased power, it had extended the life of the machine. Rolls-Royce test engineers in Hucknall later calculated that detonation onset had been delayed by nearly 4 milliseconds per cycle. In engine terms, that gap was an eternity. It meant stability under pressures that would have shredded a 100-octane charge. The proof came again 2 weeks later over St. Lo. The 302nd Group, flying cover for the advancing ground forces, intercepted Bf-109Gs attempting to strike Allied columns. The engagement lasted less than 4 minutes. In the after-action report, pilots noted they could outrun and outclimb anything encountered. One described a German fighter falling as if engines had failed. It had not failed. It had simply reached the limit of its chemistry. Luftwaffe technicians at Rechlin compiled their own assessments. Captured P-51 fragments revealed high lead residues on spark plugs, evidence of richer combustion mixtures. Analysts concluded the Americans were using a special additive of unknown composition. They suspected nitromethane or methanol injection, not realizing the secret lay in refining, not in trick devices. German research into higher octane synthesis was already years behind. Their hydrogenation plants could barely maintain 97 Aron production, while Allied fuel now reached 150 performance number. By August, the results were statistical. In 3 months of operations using 150 grade, the 8th Air Force's Mustang groups increased kill ratios from 2.3 to 1 to 6.1 to 1. Escort losses fell by half. Climb times to $9,000 dropped from 8 minutes to under 6. German ground controllers noted the change and misidentified the aircraft as a new Mustang type with special engines. It was the same machine, same weight, same airframe, transformed by chemistry alone. The visual difference appeared subtle. Exhaust flames a shade more blue, vapor trails thinner in cold air, engines running smoother at throttle. But in combat, the margin was overwhelming. Pilots reported the ability to sustain full power for 8 minutes without engine knock, an eternity in air combat. Enemy fighters trying to dive away found the Mustangs matching their acceleration, closing from above and behind in maneuvers that physics should have forbidden. The 357th Group's intelligence summary for July 1944 noted tersely, "Performance of aircraft with new fuel exceeds all previous limits. Enemy reaction indicates complete surprise. Recommend full conversion." The recommendation became policy within days. Tankers at British ports began unloading 150 grade exclusively for fighter command. Logistics officers marked drums with violet bands and assigned separate pumps to prevent contamination. The smell of toluene soon permeated every airfield in East Anglia. For the Luftwaffe, the response came too late. Efforts to boost octane by adding aniline and benzene led to engine failures. The Reich's refining infrastructure lacked the alkylation capacity needed to replicate the blend. When the Allies bombed Leuna and Bohlen in late May, production collapsed entirely. German pilots entered combat with underpowered engines, limited to 1.3 ETA boost, while their opponents pushed past 1.8. On July 26, the Germans launched one of their last coordinated fighter defenses near Merseburg. 90 interceptors rose against nearly 400 bombers and escorts. American losses, 6 aircraft. German losses, 31. Witnesses on the ground described Mustangs diving faster than falling objects. The phrase appeared in multiple field reports, each written independently. The phenomenon was not exaggeration. It was velocity. Back in England, the data spoke without rhetoric. Cylinder head temperatures, stable. Manifold pressure, consistent. Average power gain per aircraft, 18%. Average mission time saved, 23 minutes. Over hundreds of sorties, those minutes multiplied into hundreds of lives. By September 1944, the Luftwaffe could no longer contest the high altitudes where the bombers flew. Their aircraft, starved of fuel and chemistry, fought on in short bursts, each mission a calculated risk of detonation and fire. For the pilots of the 8th Air Force, the difference felt physical. They could climb past contrails, level out, and still accelerate. They had crossed a boundary their enemies did not know existed. The first combat proof of 150 grade fuel was not a single dogfight or a single kill. It was the silence on the radio when German formations broke apart and disappeared. In that silence lay the sound of chemistry overtaking engineering, and of a war beginning to tilt irrevocably toward those who could refine it. The transformation of flight in 1944 was not the work of new aircraft or revolutionary engines. It was the mastery of pressure, temperature, and detonation, the invisible boundaries that govern combustion. Inside, the Merlin V1657 150 grade fuel changed the arithmetic of power. What had once been a careful balance between heat and destruction became a controlled explosion of precision. At the core of the system was the 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger, an engineering inheritance from Rolls-Royce's wartime laboratories. In earlier years, every pilot knew the sound of its limits. The rising whine as altitude increased, the subtle knock that warned of fuel breakdown. Above 20,000 feet, 6 to 100 hours, normal 100-octane gasoline began to pre-ignite, creating shock waves that hammered pistons and eroded valves. Pilots throttled back, losing speed to preserve engines. The new 150 grade blend erased that ceiling. Its high octane number meant molecules resisted premature detonation even under 67 inches of manifold pressure. The result was a stable burn at power levels engineers once dismissed as suicidal. In laboratory tests, Packard technicians ran the Merlin continuously at 3,000 RPM with boost pressures equivalent to 1.8 atmospheres. Cylinder temperatures held steady at 220 Tverkdurch. Exhaust gas flow smooth and even. The limiting factor was no longer chemistry, but metallurgy. To harness the new fuel, modifications were minimal but crucial. The carburetor jets were enlarged to deliver richer mixtures. Spark plugs switched to colder heat ranges. Coolant systems received higher capacity radiators. A small methanol water injection unit, the MW50 system borrowed from RAF experiments, was installed on test engines to reduce charge temperature during combat climbs. It was rarely needed. The new fuel already cooled itself through latent evaporation. The secret lay in its composition. Roughly 40% of the blend was triptolwan, an aromatic hydrocarbon dense in energy and resistant to knock. Another 30% was iso-octane, a compound with smooth, predictable flame propagation. The remaining fraction consisted of alkylates and lead additives, up to 6.6 cc of tetraethyl lead per U.S. gallon, 1.74 cc L. This toxic metal acted as a chemical cushion, slowing combustion just enough for maximum pressure to occur after the piston reached top dead center. In effect, the detonation point moved with the engine's rhythm, not against it. Every Mustang that took off with purple fuel carried a miniature chemistry experiment in motion. When the spark ignited, molecules fractured in a cascade of reactions measured in microseconds. Carbon bonds releasing energy, hydrogen recombining, lead scavenging radicals before they could form shock fronts. The engine no longer fought its own power stroke. It surfed it. For pilots, the change felt physical. The throttle could be advanced without hesitation. Climbs began instantly, not gradually. The boost gauge no longer dictated fear. At altitude, where oxygen thinned and performance usually faded, the Merlin continued to pull as if the air itself had grown denser. Some called it supercharged, a phrase that never appeared in manuals but captured what they felt. German engineers noticed the difference in wreckage. Crashed Mustangs recovered near Bremen, and castles showed piston crowns coated with a thin layer of lead oxide, a sign of combustion far hotter than their own fuels allowed. Analysis teams at Rechlin tried to replicate it with benzene-rich blends and methanol additives, but the results were unstable. Engines detonated, valves melted, bearings failed. Without access to abundant toluene and alkylation capacity, the chemistry remained out of reach. The technical reports from Wright Field during this period read like blueprints of control. Charts showed pressure curves rising higher and flatter, combustion intervals shorten, fuel-air ratios adjusted to a near-perfect stoichiometric balance. Each adjustment brought a marginal gain, but the margins compounded. A 3% improvement in thermal efficiency became 5% in climb rate, 7% in range, 10% in kill ratio. When mechanics first drained the new fuel into open trays, its color shifted in sunlight, deep violet, almost black at the edges. It smelled of metal and solvent, a warning of its potency. One drop on bare skin burned cold before evaporating. Ground crews handled it with gloves and filtered masks. They called it witch's blood. By the autumn of 1944, every American Merlin in Europe was rated for a 150-grade operation. What had begun as an experiment had become a doctrine. Engineers no longer debated safe limits, they rewrote them. Combustion ceased to be a constraint. It became a weapon. In the balance of war, the leap was not visible from the ground. But in the thin blue air above 8,000 IM, where temperature fell to 40 degrees C and engines screamed against physics itself, the difference could be measured in the simplest metric of all, the distance left between a Mustang's exhaust and the fireball it created behind a German wing. No weapon mattered without supply. The triumph of 150-grade fuel depended not on chemistry alone, but on movement, barrels, ships, pumps, and men who understood that one spill, one leak, could erase an air campaign. The liquid that made Mustangs climb like meteors traveled farther than any aircraft it powered. Each drum began its journey in the refineries of Stanlow, Haysham, and Shell Haven. Purple bands were painted around their rims, not for decoration, but for warning. The color marked volatility. One spark could ignite vapors from 20 meters away. Filling lines ran underground in copper-lined channels. Workers wore anti-static boots and grounded cables before every transfer. The refinery schedule ran 24 hours, blending aromatic stocks, filtering lead residues, and testing each batch with octane engines calibrated to the thinnest margin of detonation. From the British refineries, tanker trucks rolled under blackout to the ports of Bristol and Liverpool. Each truck carried only 6,000 liters, a fraction of its capacity, because vibration could trigger vaporization. The convoy system that once moved munitions now moved fuel. Escorts patrolled every route. In storage depots near the coast, the drums waited in long rows under tarpaulin, breathing faint fumes of toluene into the damp night. At the docks, American Liberty ships took on the cargo. Their holds were lined with steel drums packed in sand to prevent sparks. Loading teams wore wool clothing to avoid static. Each ship carried up to 1.5 million liters, enough for roughly a month of operations for one fighter group. Crossing the Atlantic, they steamed in convoys guarded by destroyers, the same convoys that had once carried tanks and ammunition. Now they carried speed itself. When the ships reached England, Royal Engineers and U.S. Army fuel officers handled transfer to inland depots. Standard practice demanded triple filtration before issue. The first filter removed water condensed from the voyage, the second captured particulate matter, and the third verified density within 0.5% tolerance. Only then could it be certified as 150-grade operational. The paper trail followed every barrel, batch number, refinery origin, ship name, arrival date. Loss of even one drum required written explanation. Fuel distribution to combat groups followed the same precision as aircraft assembly. The 8th Air Force's Petroleum Section at Burtonwood oversaw the network, pipelines, trucks, rail cars, and airfield storage. Each base maintained separate tanks for 100 octane and 150 grade to avoid cross-contamination. Ground crews flushed hoses with alcohol before connection. At Leiston, Debden, and Boxted, men worked through the night transferring fuel under red lamps. They said the fumes made the air taste metallic. The logistical web stretched deep into occupied Europe after D-Day. Engineers of the 9th Air Force constructed temporary storage depots behind the front using collapsible canvas tanks, each holding 11,000 liters. Pump units drew fuel from tanker trucks and filled aircraft directly in dispersal zones. A single depot could sustain 50 sorties a day. Maintaining that flow required thousands of drivers, clerks, and chemists, soldiers who would never see combat yet determined its outcome. Every drop of the new fuel was tracked like ammunition. Reports from July 1944 show consumption rates rising from 1.8 to 2.1 liters per minute during combat flight, but mission efficiency improving by a quarter. A gallon burned faster, but each gallon carried the power of 2. Allied logistics officers calculated that 1 additional ton of 150 grade delivered to Europe yielded the equivalent combat value of 3 tons of 100 octane. In war's arithmetic, the equation was unbeatable. German intelligence never grasped the system's scale. Intercepted communications spoke of special American petrol, arriving in large quantities, but analysts dismissed it as exaggeration. They could not imagine an economy able to refine, ship, and distribute millions of liters of such volatile material while still fighting on two oceans. Behind the scenes, chemical engineers fought a different war, one of purity and stability. Toluene imports from the United States arrived at British ports under naval escort, mixed immediately into blending tanks before enemy bombers could target them. Lead supplies came from Canadian smelters and American mines. Even a shortage of ethylene dibromide, used to neutralize lead deposits, could ground entire squadrons. The men at the blending plants worked with respirators and lead-lined gloves. Many never recovered from the exposure. Their sacrifice never appeared in after-action reports. By autumn, purple-banded barrels lined every airfield from East Anglia to the French coast. Each represented an invisible link between laboratory, refinery, convoy, and cockpit. When a Mustang roared off the runway, its shadow crossed hundreds of kilometers of human effort. The pilot saw only power. The mechanics smelled progress in fumes that stung the eyes and clung to their clothes for days. The logistics of 150-grade fuel were not glamorous. There were no medals for loading hoses at midnight, no parades for refinery workers who collapsed from fumes. Yet every victory over Europe depended on their precision. The fastest aircraft on Earth flew because the slow, methodical rhythm of logistics never faltered. In that rhythm, chemistry became infrastructure, and infrastructure became strategy. The true weapon of the air war was not the P-51 itself, but the continuous pulse of fuel lines stretching from the Gulf Coast to a French meadow, carrying the distilled speed of an entire industrial world. Behind the front lines, thousands of kilometers from the sound of engines and gunfire, the real power of the 150-grade fuel lay in machinery that never moved. America's refineries became the hidden battlefields of the air war. Factories of chemistry, where the outcome of Europe was measured not in sorties, but in barrels per day. In 1942, the War Production Board ordered an expansion of alkylation plants across the United States. Standard Oil of New Jersey, Shell, Texaco, and Phillips built entire cities of steel and pipework within months. Each plant consumed rivers of isobutane, olefins, and acid catalysts. Towers of stainless steel rose above the Gulf Coast, venting the heat of reactions that turned vapor into the clear, dense liquid, later tinted purple for aviation use. The air smelled of sulfur and ozone. Workers called it the scent of altitude. The process itself was an industrial symphony. At 40 degrees and pressures exceeding 700 kPa, gaseous hydrocarbons collided in acid chambers to form alkylates, smooth-burning molecules ideal for high-octane fuel. The product was then neutralized with caustic soda, washed, distilled, and blended with aromatic stocks rich in toluene and xylene. Every stage demanded absolute precision. A slight impurity could lower the octane index or corrode an aircraft's fuel system. By 1944, U.S. production of high-octane gasoline exceeded 4.6 billion gallons per year. Of that, roughly 10% qualified as 150 grade, the elite fraction reserved for fighters. At Baton Rouge alone, the Standard Oil refinery processed 250,000 barrels per day, enough to power 15,000 Mustangs for a week of operations. The Chicago and Baytown complexes matched those numbers, feeding storage depots and pipelines that ran eastward to the docks. Inside the plants, the workforce mirrored the scale of mobilization. Chemists in white coats tested samples every hour using CFR knock engines that simulated the combustion of a Merlin cylinder. Outside, welders worked through rain and lightning, their torches reflecting off wet steel. The noise never stopped. Compressors roared, valves hammered, Pumps vibrated like living organs. War correspondent Albert Lanier visited the Baton Rouge site in 1943 and wrote, "It feels less like a factory than a power station for the sky." At the same time, Britain's own refining efforts stretched its industrial capacity to the edge. Shellhaven on the Thames produced smaller quantities, supported by Stanlow and Heysham in the north. Their limitation was not skill, but space, a lack of crude oil feedstock and room for expansion. American tankers filled the gap. Each week, convoys from Texas and Louisiana discharged more than 50,000 tons of blending components at British ports, an invisible artery pumping energy into an island at war. Every barrel required materials as strategic as the fuel itself. Catalysts for alkylation depended on hydrofluoric and sulfuric acids, both produced in restricted facilities under armed guard. Storage tanks needed special linings to resist corrosion from lead compounds. Rubber gaskets deteriorated within weeks. They were replaced with new synthetic polymers, developed by DuPont and Goodyear. Industrial chemistry evolved under pressure, each innovation born from the urgency of maintaining flow. The human cost was rarely recorded. Workers exposed to tetraethyl lead developed tremors and vision loss. Some died before the war ended. In Louisiana, entire hospital wards were dedicated to refinery poisoning cases. Yet, production never paused. "They were fighting their war through us," one plant foreman said years later. "We didn't carry rifles, but we breathed the same poison that gave them victory." Across the Atlantic, the British Ministry of Aircraft Production tracked deliveries with military precision. Reports listed every shipment by tonnage, arrival date, and blending destination. In March 1944, total Allied output of 150-grade fuel surpassed 100,000 barrels per day, a volume greater than the entire German aviation fuel industry combined. The Reich's chemists could only watch as their coal-to-liquid plants struggled under bombing raids, producing fuel with half the octane and double the impurities. At Wright Field, test benches ran day and night to convert industrial data into tactical advantage. Engineers recorded power curves for the Merlin FA 1650, the Allison V1710, and the radial Pratt & Whitney R2800. The results were immediate. At identical boost pressures, engines running on 150 grade developed between 15 and 22% more thrust, while thermal efficiency rose nearly 6%. A margin that small could decide entire air campaigns. The factories treated that margin as sacred. When one refinery near Houston suffered a fire in July 1944, production resumed within 48 hours. Men replaced molten pipe sections still glowing red. Photographs show workers in asbestos suits walking through steam clouds, their silhouettes distorted by heat. Behind them, new columns were already being welded into place. Every hour mattered. Every barrel lost meant fewer climbs, fewer escorts, fewer lives saved. By late 1944, the logistical and industrial apparatus had fused into a single organism. Crude oil entered at Port Arthur, fuel exited at East Anglia airfields, transformed by science and discipline. Each refinery, tanker, and pump was a cell in a living system designed to feed flight. The Luftwaffe never saw it. To German intelligence, the Allied fuel advantage remained an abstraction, a line on a chart, a rumor in pilot reports. They could not imagine an enemy whose laboratories functioned like divisions and whose pipelines fought with the same determination as infantry. The industrial backbone of 150-grade fuel was not visible from the sky, yet every glint of contrail over Europe traced its origin to those refineries, towers of steel burning day and night, turning crude oil into velocity and velocity into victory. By the autumn of 1944, the air war above Europe no longer resembled the struggle of a year before. The same P-51s that had once fought to stay alive over Bremen and Berlin now hunted with the certainty of predators. The chemistry hidden in their fuel tanks had rewritten every rule of air combat. Tactics evolved overnight. The 8th Air Force abandoned tight escort formations in favor of roaming fighter sweeps, confident that range and speed no longer demanded compromise. Flights of 4 aircraft dispersed across entire sectors, each Mustang operating as a node in an invisible network of control. With radio discipline drilled to perfection and engines capable of instant power response, coordination replaced mass. Pilots learned to use the new reserves of energy like a weapon. At 25,000 feet, 7,620 Mach, the Mustangs could accelerate from cruise to combat speed in 9 seconds, a climb profile no German piston fighter could match. The old boom and zoom tactic became something more fluid, a continuous climb and strike pattern that exploited both altitude and momentum. German interceptors rose to meet bombers and found themselves overtaken before reaching firing range. Lieutenant Colonel John Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group described it simply: "You could outclimb anything, outrun anything, and if you dived away, they'd never catch you again." His combat reports from late 1944 read like mechanical test data: altitude, angle, airspeed, ammunition used, stripped of emotion. Precision had replaced instinct. The Luftwaffe responded with desperation. New variants, the Bf-109K4 and FW-190D9, arrived with improved superchargers and refined aerodynamics, but they ran on 87-octane synthetic fuel blended from coal. Even with emergency boost, their engines detonated at manifold pressures. American pilots called cruise power. Field tests at Rechlin confirmed what combat already proved. Higher output required higher octane, and Germany could not make it. At altitude, the contrast was merciless. The Mustang's supercharger fed dense charge air to the Merlin cylinders while the German engines starved. A P-51 could still climb at 4,500 elves per minute, 370 bar-min, at 8 kilometers. A 109K4 barely managed half. The air war turned vertical, a contest of who could hold height longer. And the answer was always the same. Combat over Kassel in November 1944 displayed the shift in doctrine. 60 bombers attacked refineries while the 357th and 364th Fighter Groups swept ahead. German radar picked up the formation and launched 140 interceptors. The Mustangs never waited. They divided into altitude bands, striking the defenders before they reached the bombers. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. American losses, 4. German losses, 37 confirmed, 19 probable. Gun camera footage showed fighters diving through clouds at nearly 500 maniemaf, 805 km/h, wings vibrating but intact. The kill ratios reflected more than pilot skill. With 150-grade fuel, Mustangs could use full throttle without hesitation. Combat power no longer meant limited bursts. It became a continuous state. Climb, dive, roll, each maneuver performed at pressures that would have destroyed engines in 1943. The Luftwaffe's own pilots remarked on it. Captain Heinz Baer wrote in his log, "Their engines do not tire. Ours sound like hammers in the sky." Ground controllers adapted in vain. Interceptor wings shifted to low-altitude ambush tactics, but even there the fuel's advantage persisted. The Merlin's torque at takeoff allowed faster acceleration, shorter runway runs, quicker recovery after dives. When Mustangs escorted Thunderbolts on strafing runs, the Germans discovered that the bombers they aimed to trap were covered by fighters that could climb back to altitude in minutes. By winter, aerial combat had become asymmetrical. American formations operated at will, switching from escort to attack to reconnaissance in the same mission. The 8th Air Force flew 1,000-mile, 1,600-gallon kilometer, round trips to targets deep inside Germany, refueled, rearmed, and flew again before sunset. The Luftwaffe could barely launch twice a day. In this new order, doctrine itself transformed. Commanders no longer viewed fighters as protective screens, but as offensive instruments of air denial. The Mustang's speed turned it into an executioner of opportunity, able to patrol rail lines, airfields, and columns hours after the bombers had gone. By the end of 1944, half of all Luftwaffe aircraft destroyed in the West fell not during interceptions, but while trying to land or refuel. For German pilots, the sky became foreign territory. Radio messages recorded panic. "They are above us again. Cannot shake them. Engines overheating." Those transmissions faded into static as fuel lines ran dry. For the first time since 1939, the Luftwaffe no longer dictated combat altitude or timing. The initiative belonged entirely to the side that controlled octane and production. In reports to Allied High Command, General Jimmy Doolittle wrote that, "Fuel is now the determining factor in air dominance." It was not metaphor. Chemistry had dictated tactics, and tactics had rewritten strategy. Speed was no longer a measure of design. It was a consequence of supply. The Mustang had become more than a fighter. It was the visible expression of an empire of refineries, pipelines, and laboratories operating with a single purpose. Every victory spiraled upward from that invisible foundation, burning violet in the exhaust trails that stretched across the cold sky of Europe. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe was no longer a force, but a pattern of wreckage across the continent. Airfields from Kassel to Dresden were littered with half-buried fighters, engines seized, fuselages scorched by their own fuel. The sky that had once belonged to Germany now echoed with the sound of Allied patrols tracing circuits above the ruins. Every sortie ended the same way: a German climb that failed to meet the altitude, a pursuit that never closed the distance, and then silence. The breakdown had begun months earlier, invisible at first. The synthetic fuel plants that supplied every Luftwaffe squadron were the most vulnerable link in Germany's war machine. Between May and September 1944, Allied bombers struck Leuna, Pölitz, and Bohlen until the production of aviation gasoline fell by 85%. When output resumed, it was contaminated by tar and ash. Mechanics at frontline bases filtered fuel through gauze to remove solid matter before pumping it into BF-109s and FW-190s. Pilots report engines that coughed like dying animals. Detonation limits dropped. Boost pressure was reduced to avoid explosions. In contrast, Allied storage depots overflowed. Tanker convoys crossed the channel daily, unloading purple-banded drums at Cherbourg, Antwerp, and Le Havre. The 8th and 9th Air Forces expanded operations beyond escort into total air denial. Mustangs and Thunderbolts hunted rail yards, bridges, and any moving target with the wheels. The fuel that had given them speed now gave them endurance. A single fighter could remain airborne for 6 hours, covering an operational radius of nearly 1,000 kilometers. German defenses shrank to isolated pockets. Replacement pilots arrived with barely 30 hours of flight time, flying machines that burned unstable fuel and suffered mechanical failure at full throttle. Some carried orders forbidding the use of emergency power. The word Notleistung, once a term for brief bursts of heroism, became a warning of suicide. Intercepts recorded at the Allied Monitoring Service revealed the tone of collapse. Major Hannes Trautloft transmitted from the Central Command Net, "No contact with adjacent groups. Request direction." Minutes later came another voice, broken and static-filled. "Cannot maintain altitude. Engine temperature beyond limit. Returning." By then there was nowhere to return to. The strategic picture was equally terminal. In January, the Germans attempted one final counteroffensive in the air, Operation Bodenplatte, a low-level strike on Allied airfields during the Ardennes campaign. 200 Luftwaffe aircraft were destroyed in a single morning. Many crashed before reaching the front, engines detonating during takeoff from impure fuel. The operation that was meant to restore air superiority instead ended it forever. For the Allied pilots who witnessed the final months, the shift was surreal. Encounters that had once demanded desperate energy became executions. P-51s swept through contrails, their Merlins humming at combat power for hours without strain. They attacked interceptors before the climb began, cutting through formations too weak to scatter. It felt like racing ghosts, one pilot wrote. They were still there, but already gone. In destroyed hangars, American technical teams examined what remained. Most German fighters carried 87 octane gasoline blended with benzene, corrosive, low energy, and barely combustible at altitude. No refinery in the Reich could produce the 150 grade equivalent. Engineers noted cracked spark plugs, warped pistons, melted valves. On a workbench at Merseburg, a single drum of Allied fuel was discovered intact. The label, still legible, read 100-150 grade, aviation use only. To the German technicians, it might as well have been a relic from another civilization. By March, the Rhine crossings were secured, and Allied columns advanced under constant air cover. The Luftwaffe's remaining jets, Me-262s that might have changed the war, launched with only minutes of fuel and untrained pilots. Most never reached the fight. When Field Marshal Walter Model sent his final message from the Ruhr pocket, it contained no strategy, no orders, only the admission of silence. No contact with higher command. Fighting continues, but coordination impossible. Over Germany's cities, contrails merged into a single silver haze stretching east to west. It was not battle smoke, but the trace of an air force that could no longer rise to meet its enemy. The skies had been reduced to one equation. Altitude equaled survival, and altitude belonged to those who could fuel it. When the fighting ended in May 1945, the evidence of victory filled hangars instead of museums. Rows of P-51Ds sat with engines still warm from the last patrols, their fuselages streaked with oil and the faint violet stains of 150 grade fuel. Mechanics drained the tanks into drums marked "Return to Refinery," unsure what future such fuel would have now that the sky was quiet. In the silence that followed, the mathematics of chemistry had already written its verdict. Allied investigators cataloged the wreckage of the German Air Force with the same precision once reserved for bombing tables. Reports noted that almost every Luftwaffe engine captured showed signs of pre-ignition damage. Octane shortages had turned metallurgy into weakness. The Reich's scientists, among the best in the world, had been defeated not by intelligence but by production, by an opponent that could convert crude oil into altitude faster than any ideology could compensate. In Washington and London, technical boards assembled the lessons into doctrine. High-octane research continued through the late 1940s, feeding directly into jet-age fuels for the first turbojets and afterburning engines. The 150 grade program had proven that power could be multiplied without redesign, that combustion chemistry could decide wars as surely as weapons. Every aircraft that followed, the Sabre, the Phantom, even the first generation of space rockets, carried some echo of the purple fuel's chemistry in their formulation tables. In Germany's post-war laboratories, surviving engineers studied captured Allied fuel samples with disbelief. The Bundeswehr's later manuals would describe high-octane aviation's gasoline as the invisible determinant of Allied air superiority. The phrase became part of NATO training, an acknowledgement that the key to modern warfare lay not in steel, but in the molecules that fed it. Historians often spoke of the P-51 Mustang as the aircraft that won the skies of Europe. The truth was colder. The Mustang was the instrument, the fuel was the reason. The combination of metallurgy, logistics, and chemistry had created the first fully integrated weapon system, an alliance between engine and element. Speed and range, climb and endurance, all were byproducts of an industrial rhythm that began in refineries thousands of kilometers away. On airfields from Leiston to Bodney, the last ground crews wiped residue from engine cowlings and rolled empty barrels aside. The war in the air had ended as it was fought, methodically, scientifically, without flourish, and the exhaust trails fading above a defeated continent. The shape of the future was already visible, machines powered not merely by design, but by knowledge distilled into liquid form. The sky had been conquered by chemistry, and for the first time in history, victory smelled faintly of toluene and lead.